Thank you. Our final speaker this evening is Tony Greenstein, which I think most of you will know that among Tony's many achievements, he's recently authored this book, Zionism During the Holocaust, which I encourage all of you to obtain and read. Tony, you're our final speaker. Welcome, and over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Esther, and a welcome to everyone who's come here. There's over 300 people who've attended, which I think is absolutely great. My first comment, and I agree with all the contributions, I think they've been brilliant. My first comment is actually to Garda when she said that she didn't really belong here. On the contrary, you more than anyone belong at this meeting. And the reason is very simple, that without the way that Israel has manipulated the Holocaust narrative and the conclusions to have been drawn from it, it would not have been able to get away with what it has done. It has mercilessly exploited the Holocaust, the tragedy not only, of course, of the Jews, but the Gypsies, the disabled, gays, and so on, in order to pursue its murderous course of action. And I used to recoil when people compared what happens or what's happened to the Palestinians to the Jews and others in Europe, because I thought talk of genocide and Holocaust was hyperbole. But today we can see the actions of Israel in Gaza, and they are really no different from what the Nazis did in Warsaw and its demolition of the Warsaw Ghetto. And yet, despite that, of course, the West gives them support, and that should be on their conscience if they had a conscience. It's also, I think, ironic that the judgment of the International Court of Justice, for all its faults and failings, and I agree with Ilan that it showed cowardice in not calling for a ceasefire. It knew its place in a sense. It didn't want to challenge the US administration, but it is ironic that that was delivered one day before Holocaust Memorial Day. And just a word about Holocaust Memorial Day, because this was really a recent invention in Britain. I think it was in about 1999 that the Blair government instituted such a day. And yet it only commemorates or remembers the genocides which have taken place since the Nazi Holocaust. So it doesn't include all the genocide from the African slave trade to what happened in the Congo, what happened in Southwest Africa in its remit. And I think that is also a mark of shame. It was Norman Finkelstein who first coined the term Holocaust industry. And what we have around us today is that Holocaust industry. I wish to quote an Israeli historian, Boaz Evron, when he said about what's called Holocaust awareness, which is what they are dedicated to, that this is an official propagandist indoctrinating, churning out slogans and a false view of the world, the real aim of which is not at all an understanding of the past, but a manipulation of the present. And that is exactly what we are facing today. And we see that in the institution that Israel created, Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, which is ironically situated literally a stone's throw from the massacre at Deir Yassin. And Danny Dayan, who is the chairman of Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, was asked to condemn what was happening in Gaza and to join the calls for a ceasefire. And Dayan refused. And that's not surprising, firstly, because Danny Dayan was a former member. He stood for the Knesset for Techia, a right-wing settler party. He is himself a settler. And Yad Vashem has never once condemned or criticized Israeli policies towards the Palestinians. It has refused to draw any universal lessons at all from what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. And that is why I think we must treat it for what it is, a propaganda museum. And it's not surprising. Tom Segev, in his book, The Seventh Million, described how the idea for Yad Vashem arose. And it arose, the first proposal to establish it came in September 1942 from Mordechai Shenhavi at a board meeting of the Jewish National Fund. This was when most of Europe's Jews were still alive. And it was seen as the very last opportunity, and I'm quoting, to score any financial success. In other words, the proposal to establish a memorial to the Jewish dead in the Holocaust was proposed while they were still living. And that, I think, symbolizes the utter cynicism of the Zionists towards the Holocaust. The question is, why do we remember the Holocaust? What is the purpose of this? And I think for most of us, it's symbolized in the slogan, never again. Never again what happened to the Jews and others should happen to any other people. But for the Zionists, it has a particular meaning, namely that never again applies solely to the Jews. It applies to nobody else. There are no anti-racist lessons to be drawn from the Holocaust, no lessons about the evils of colonialism and where it leads. On the contrary, the Holocaust is the justification for everything that Israel does. And it reminds me of an article that Gideon Levy, one of the few decent Israeli journalists, wrote in Haaretz. He wrote this about the fact that Israel sends every year thousands of Israeli teenagers to Auschwitz, not in order that they can draw the necessary anti-racist conclusions, but quite the opposite, to instill in them a kind of militaristic nationalism. And Levy wrote, I have yet to hear a single teenager come back from Auschwitz and say that we mustn't abuse others the way we were abused. There has yet to be a school whose pupils came back from Birkenau, which is where the killings took place in the gas chambers, straight to the Gaza border, saw the barbed wire fence and said never again. The message is always the opposite. Gaza is permitted because of Auschwitz. And that is the lesson that Zionism has drawn from the Holocaust. But for us, as Ilan Pappe has pointed out, there has been a consistent attempt to paint the Palestinians as the new Nazis. And that is something we have to resist. And there was also outrage when South Africa referred Israel to the International Court. They said, how can you do this, given that we have suffered from the Holocaust? And my response to them is very clear, that racism is not a biological property of a particular people. Any group of people, whatever their ethnicity, given the right set of circumstances, can perpetrate a genocide. And that has been true throughout history. The victims can also become perpetrators. And that is what we are seeing in Israel today. Israel didn't come out of the Holocaust. The Zionist settler colonial movement began at the end of the 19th century. But nonetheless, the Holocaust has shaped Israel and its narrative, because, of course, immediately after the Second World War, it played down the Holocaust because it gave the wrong lessons. But in the wake of the Eichmann trial, then Israel wholeheartedly adopted the Holocaust narrative and used it for their own purposes. And it's quite interesting, I think, that Germany intervened or added its support for Israel at the International Court, much to the outrage, I have to say, of Namibia, Southwest Africa, because Germany has been in the forefront of the attack on Palestine solidarity, including Jewish anti-Zionist activists. And I have to say that when Germany supports Israel at the ICJ, when Germany gives support to the Israeli state, it is actually following in the footsteps of Nazi Germany itself. People don't remember, and this is partly why I wrote my book. People do not remember that during the Hitler period, because the Holocaust began in 1941, Hitler came to power in January 1933. During that period, the Nazis were the favored children of the Nazis. They alone were singled out amongst the Jewish community. Don't forget, the German Jewish community was overwhelmingly non or anti-Zionist. The Zionists comprised just 2% of German Jews. And they were the ones that the Nazis oriented to, because they too understood the importance of race and eugenics and biology. And in 1935, the man who's called the engineer of the final solution, Reinhard Heydrich, he issued a directive stating, and I quote, "The activity of the Zionist-oriented youth organizations that are engaged in the occupational restructuring of the Jews lies in the interest of the National Socialist state leadership. They are not to be treated with that strictness that it is necessary to apply to members of the so-called German Jewish organizations, brackets, assimilationists." And similarly, in May of 1935, Schwarzkopf, which was the paper of the SS, wrote that the Zionists adhere to a strict racial position, and by emigrating to Palestine, they are helping to build their own Jewish state. The assimilation-minded Jews, that is 98% of the German Jewish community, deny their race and insist on their loyalty to Germany or claim to be Christians, because they have been baptized in order to subvert National Socialist principles. And I should add that Nazi Germany introduced a quite novel concept, because feudal anti-Semitism, people like Martin Luther, always believed that once you convert someone who is Jewish, that was an end to the matter. They were Christian and that was that. But for the Nazis, it didn't matter if you converted, you were still Jewish by race. And so you had the new phenomena of German Christians, and the same, of course, in Hungary and other parts of Europe. They too would go to the gas chambers. And it reminded me when the campaign, Israel's attack on Gaza, began really with the statement of Yoav Gallant, Israel's defense minister, or we might say Israel's war minister. People might remember what he said. He said there will be no food, there will be no water, there will be no medicine, there will be no fuel. And he described the Palestinians as human animals. And this recalled to me what Heinrich Himmler, who in essence, the chief of the SS, which was in charge of the implementation of the final solution. It was in a speech to senior SS officers, generals, in a speech in Poznan, which is now in Poland, on the 4th of October, 1943, when he praised the Nazis as the only people in the world to have taken, quote, a decent attitude towards animals, and who would be equally decent towards human animals. So this is really what the attack on Gaza is. It is no different in terms of its narrative, in terms of its attitude, in terms of the determination of the Zionists to ethnically cleanse it from what the Nazis did. Because we should remember, the Nazi program in 1933 was not extermination, it was not genocide, it was ethnic cleansing. They wanted Jews to leave Germany. And that is exactly similar to the attitude of the Zionists today. And of course, if you can't get ethnic cleansing, then you indulge in genocide. And that's exactly what Israel is doing today.
Are you nearly finished, Tony?
Yeah, if you can give me another couple of minutes or so.
Will do. Okay.
The reason why I wrote my book is precisely because I think we have to, if you like, challenge the narrative of the Zionists over their use of anti-fascism, over their use of what happened during the Holocaust. And I think it's worthwhile to remember that when the Nazis came to power, the only section of the Jewish community which effectively welcomed them and saw in them something that could be exploited was the Zionist movement. And for instance, Burl Katznelson, who was in a sense a deputy to Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister, described the rise of Hitler as an opportunity to build and flourish like none we have ever had or ever will have. And Ben-Gurion himself was even more optimistic. The Nazi victory would become a fertile force for Zionism. And they weren't the only ones. Noah Lucas, who was a critical Zionist historian, he wrote, and I quote, "As the European Holocaust erupted, Ben-Gurion saw it as a decisive opportunity for Zionism. In conditions of peace, Zionism could not move the masses of world Jewry. The forces unleashed by Hitler in all of their horror must be harnessed to the advantage of Zionism. By the end of 1942, the struggle for a Jewish state became the primary concern of Zionism." So we saw, for instance, when it was very clear after Kristallnacht, the German pogrom, the Nazi pogrom against the Jews in November 1938, what the intentions of the Nazis were, namely extermination if necessary. And the British government agreed to the immigration of 10,000 Jewish children to Britain. I mean, I say this was quite unique. What was the attitude of the Zionists? Did they welcome it? No, on the contrary. Their attitude was if they couldn't go to Palestine, they should not go anywhere. And Ben-Gurion made a famous quote, and it's in his official biography by Shabtai Teva. And he said, and I quote, "If I knew it was possible or would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them by transporting them to the land of Israel, then I would opt for the second alternative. For we must weigh not only the life of these children, but also the history of the people of Israel." And I think it's important, therefore, to remind ourselves of the record of Zionism during the Holocaust. Alone amongst, if you like, the Jewish people, it saw only advantages in what was happening. And that's why they actually actively obstructed rescue attempts to places that were not, that weren't Palestine. And that is in my book. But I want to end, in a sense, on an optimistic note, because like Ilan Pappe, I think we are witnessing the beginning of the end of Zionism. It may be bloody, but I think Israel has a limited shelf life, and we should look forward to its demise. A Jewish state is a monstrosity, just like the Christian ethno-nationalist states in Europe, which took part in the Holocaust eagerly, were a monstrosity. The only solution in Palestine is a democratic secular state. A two-state solution means the state of Israel would remain. It is, in essence, an apartheid solution. So sorry for having gone over time, and I look forward to the questions and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. So we're